Tonight, we step quietly into one of the Vatican's most unsettling mysteries. A winter when Rome's streets were restless and the church's walls seemed taller than ever. Inside a convent, a number of nuns vanished, gone without trace, leaving behind silence, suspicion, and questions the Vatican never truly answered. It is tempting to romanticize the cloisters with their candlelight, prayers, and songs, but beneath the beauty of ritual, there was often fear, control, and secrecy. This story is not about faith alone. It is about power, silence, and the lives that may have been hidden away forever. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these late-night journeys into the shadows of history. And I'd love for you to drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Let a soft hum of background noise carry you. And together, let's explore what happened when the Vatican's veil of silence fell over the vanished nuns of 1831. Rome at the start of the 19th century was a city caught between grandeur and unease. The marble ruins still whispered of an empire long fallen. But within the Vatican walls, power remained firm, its rituals unbroken. Beyond the gilded altars, however, the city struggled with unrest. There were secret gatherings, mutterings of rebellion, and a constant fear that disease could sweep through the crowded streets without warning. In this unsettled climate, one story took root, a story that even then few dared to speak aloud. Within a convent not far from the heart of the papal city, a small group of women seemed to have vanished. They were not travelers or pilgrims who could have slipped away unnoticed. They were cloistered nuns whose lives were bound by obedience and routine. Yet suddenly their presence was gone, their cells empty, their voices absent from the choir. Rome has seen many tragedies, but this disappearance carried with it a chill, for the silence was deeper than death and more troubling than mere rumor. The event was not recorded openly in parish logs or daily bulletins. Instead, it passed into whispers and shadows, a secret that clung to the stones of the convent and slowly spread through the city beyond. The city that surrounded the Vatican was alive with contradictions. Pilgrims still arrived to kneel at shrines and marvel at the basilicas, but Rome itself was restless. Political tides shifted in Europe, and their waves reached the narrow streets and hidden courtyards. Soldiers marched, citizens protested, and rumors thickened like smoke in taverns and marketplaces. It was an age when fear of revolt walked side by side with fear of plague. Within this unsettled world, the sudden silence of a convent was more than a private sorrow. It was another reminder that the walls of the church could hide secrets that even kings dared not question. Some whispered that the missing women had been taken to quiet a scandal. Others muttered that illness had spread behind the cloistered doors. Yet when no funerals were seen, and no names were read aloud at Mass, suspicion only deepened. The Vatican responded, as it often did in times of unease, with guarded silence and strict decrees that discouraged questions. For ordinary Romans, the mystery became both a fascination and a danger. To speak too loudly of the vanished sisters risked punishment, yet to remain silent left an ache that pressed on the conscience of the city. This tension set the stage for one of the strangest and least remembered scandals of the century, a disappearance hidden behind walls that were never meant to be entered, watched over by men who believed that secrecy was safety. The convent at the heart of the story was known in Rome for its quiet devotion. Its gates were plain, its walls thick with age, and its chapel filled with the soft echo of daily prayers. To the outside world, it seemed a place untouched by politics or the shifting tempers of the city. Within, the nuns followed a rhythm that had changed a little over centuries. The tolling of bells marked their hours of worship, meals, and silence. Their lives were cloistered, devoted not to spectacle, but to discipline and humility. Yet behind that sense of order was a fragile balance, for the sisters depended on patrons, confessors, and the Vatican itself for survival. When whispers spread that several had vanished, it struck at the very image of stability the convent represented. To those who knew its corridors and cloisters, the absence was impossible to explain. Doors had been locked as always, and the gates had not opened to the street. Meals were set, but left uneaten. Habits and rosaries hung untouched on pegs, as though their owners had stepped away only for a moment and never returned. Rome had seen soldiers and nobles vanish into dungeons or exile, but the disappearance of cloistered women within their own walls seemed unthinkable. The convent, once a symbol of safety, had become a place of whispered dread, and the faithful began to ask whether sanctity itself had been betrayed. Life inside the convent was built on routine, a structure that gave comfort as well as constraint. Each day began before dawn, with the sound of the bell calling the sisters to prayer. They walked in silence, their habits brushing the stone floor, their voices rising together in chant. After prayer came work, tending to gardens, mending garments, and copying devotional texts in the dim light of small windows. Meals were plain, eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud. At night, the sisters retired to their cells, each furnished with little more than a wooden bed, a crucifix, and a narrow desk. It was a life stripped of worldly distraction, yet also a life of quiet strength. For generations, this pattern had endured, broken only by illness or the rare visit of a bishop. That is why the sudden disruption was so alarming. One evening, the familiar voices were present in the chapel, but by the next morning, several cells were empty. The beds remained made, the rosaries still hung, and the books left open at their last page. No sister recalled hearing footsteps or gates opening. No sign of flight or struggle was reported. It was as though the women had been plucked from their rooms by unseen hands. The daily rhythm of devotion faltered. The remaining nuns walked the halls with unease, their prayers shadowed by dread. A cloister that had once felt sealed from the troubles of Rome now seemed more vulnerable than the streets beyond its gates. The night of the disappearance became the subject of endless speculation among those who dared to speak of it. Some claimed that muffled cries had been heard beyond the chapel walls, though no one could say from which corridor they came. Others insisted that a carriage was seen lingering near the convent gate before vanishing into the fog that often settled over the city streets. Inside, the remaining sisters remembered little beyond their usual evening prayers. No door was found unlatched, no key missing from the ring held by the portress. Yet by morning, several of their number were gone, as if erased from the convent's history. Fear gripped the survivors. They searched the garden, the crypt, the kitchens, every corner where a faint hope might hide, but nothing was found. Rumors spread quickly into the city. Some believed the women had been spirited away for reasons of politics, punished for secrets never spoken. Others believed darker forces were at work, that temptation or madness had invaded the cloister. The Vatican, when pressed, offered no answers. Instead, it urged silence, commanding that faith, not speculation, guide the hearts of the people. But in Rome, silence often fuels curiosity. The absence of explanation became itself an explanation, and the people began to whisper that something unholy had crossed the convent walls. For those who lived near the gates, the memory of that night lingered like a shadow that could not be dispelled, an unspoken warning that holiness and secrecy are not always the same. When dawn broke after the night of the Vanishing, the convent was not filled with the usual rhythm of prayer, but with confusion and dread. The sisters went from cell to cell, hoping to find their companions in quiet meditation or lost in a sleepless vigil. Instead, they found order without presence. Beds were made, books rested open as if waiting to be read again. Candles stood half-burned. Nothing suggested struggle, nothing hinted at escape. The silence of those rooms felt heavier than any sound could. Some of the remaining sisters gathered their courage and unlocked the heavy doors that led to storerooms, the garden, and even the crypt beneath the chapel. They searched with trembling hands, fearing what they might discover. Yet every place was empty, the air undisturbed, the stones cold. Word reached the confessor assigned to the convent, but he offered no answers. His face was pale, his words guarded. The city beyond the gates soon learned that something had gone terribly wrong, though no announcement was ever made. The absence of funerals was noticed. No procession left the convent. No bells rang in mourning. It was as if those who vanished had been denied even the dignity of death. Among the faithful, this silence rang louder than any proclamation. To them, the locked doors and abandoned rooms were not only a mystery, but a wound to the very promise of sanctuary. What good was a wall of stone if those within could vanish without trace? The confessor attached to the convent was a man who had long been trusted by the Vatican. His duties were clear: to hear the confessions of the sisters, to guide their spiritual lives, and to report quietly to his superiors when necessary. In ordinary times, his presence was steady, almost invisible, as he moved through the cloister with solemnity. But when the disappearances unsettled the convent, he became withdrawn. The sisters noticed his visits grew shorter, his gaze more uneasy. When pressed by frightened voices to explain what might have happened, he offered only vague reassurances and urged them to keep their silence in prayer. Later, some claimed that he knew more than he admitted, that his calm exterior concealed a knowledge of decisions made beyond the convent walls. He did not speak openly, but the absence of denial spoke loudly enough. His reluctance fueled suspicion among the faithful in Rome. If a holy man, bound by duty and oaths, would not answer simple questions, then perhaps the truth was too dangerous to be spoken. Stories grew in taverns and marketplaces of clerical involvement, of orders passed down from higher offices. To some, the confessor's silence was proof of guilt. To others, it was the burden of a man bound by obedience to powers greater than himself. Whatever the truth, his refusal to break that silence became a symbol of the scandal itself, a human face to the mystery that the Vatican wished buried in shadows. When the Vatican was first made aware of the events inside the convent, its response was cautious and deliberate. The papal court understood the danger of scandal, especially in a time when Rome was already unsettled by unrest and whispers of rebellion. A disappearance of cloistered women, if acknowledged publicly, could spread unrest far faster than any political decree. And so, the first reaction was not one of open inquiry, but of control. Messages were sent quietly to local officials, instructing them to quell the rumors already drifting into the city. Priests were warned from their pulpits to discourage idle talk, urging their congregations to focus on devotion rather than gossip. Within the Vatican itself, discussions were held behind closed doors, and records that might have revealed details of the convent were tucked away in archives few would ever see. Outwardly, nothing seemed amiss. Mass continued as always, and the bells of St. Peter's still rang across the city. Yet beneath the surface, the decision to suppress the matter deepened suspicion. For the faithful, silence was rarely a comfort. If the Church refused to acknowledge the event, many concluded that it must have been something too grave, too shameful to bear the light of day. In choosing secrecy, the Vatican did not smother the fire of curiosity, it fanned it. And in the crowded alleys of Rome, the story of the vanished sisters became less a rumor and more a certainty, retold in whispers that reached farther than any decree of silence could travel. Outside the convent walls, the city buzzed with unease. Markets still opened, carriages rattled along cobbled streets, and beggars called out for alms. But beneath the everyday noise, something darker stirred. Word spread from neighbor to neighbor, from servants to masters, and from tavern to church pew. People whispered that the convent had been touched by plague, though none could name the dead. Others murmured of kidnappings, of women spirited away under cover of night by those with power enough to silence the bells. The more the Vatican insisted on silence, the more the people of Rome filled that silence with their own stories. To the faithful, the absence of funerals was a wand too obvious to ignore. To the skeptical, it was proof of conspiracy. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk near the convent gates, and men crossing themselves muttered that some sins were too great even for confession. The story grew with every telling, each detail altered but always circling the same terrible truth. Women had vanished, and no one dared say why. Even those who tried to dismiss the rumors found themselves unsettled. A city so steeped in ritual, where every death was marked with prayer and procession, could not simply look away from a disappearance that left no trace of either. Rome became a place where even daily prayers were whispered with unease, and where silence itself began to feel like complicity. Behind the guarded doors of the Vatican, a quiet investigation began. No public announcement was ever made, yet men in clerical robes were dispatched to the convent under orders to gather facts, without leaving a trace of their inquiries. They moved like shadows, interviewing the remaining sisters in hushed voices, examining ledgers and journals, walking the halls where silence hung heavier than incense. What they discovered, or what they chose to record, has never been known. Some say they found pages missing from the convent's registers, erasures where names should have been written, and strange gaps in the record of daily mass. Others claim they uncovered nothing at all, or nothing they were willing to admit. The sisters who endured the questioning were left shaken. Their vows of obedience clashed with their fear, and many spoke only in fragments, unwilling to betray either truth or loyalty. When the investigators returned to the Vatican, their reports were sealed, placed in archives, where dust soon became their only witness. The Church did not announce any findings, nor did it allow the rumors to fade naturally. Instead, it tightened its grip on silence, forbidding open discussion even among clergy. This decision left the people of Rome to draw their own conclusions, and the absence of answers became more powerful than any explanation. The investigation had been meant to bury the scandal, yet in concealing it, the Vatican ensured that the story of the vanished sisters would never truly disappear. When parish records were quietly reviewed after the disappearances, they revealed more than the Vatican might have wished. Pages that should have listed baptisms, confessions, and burials were either missing or marked with strange gaps. Entire lines of names were struck through, leaving blank spaces where the routine of convent life should have been carefully noted. The ledgers of the sisters themselves, once so meticulous in recording chores, prayers, and supplies, also bore signs of erasure. In some places, ink had been scraped away, in others, entire sections torn from the bindings. The effect was chilling, for it suggested not carelessness, but deliberate removal. To the few who glimpsed these gaps, the message was unmistakable. Someone within the church had sought to ensure that the vanished women left no trace in the written record. But memory cannot be erased as easily as parchment. The surviving sisters remember the names and faces of those who were gone and whisper them softly in their private prayers. Outside the convent, townsfolk who had once seen the nuns walk in procession noticed their absence and spoke of it with growing certainty. The emptiness on the page only deepened the mystery, making the vanished appear less like individuals lost to fate and more like figures erased from history itself. In the silence of the archives, truth was replaced with absence, and absence grew heavier with each retelling. Within the convent itself, the women who remained found their community fractured. Some clung fiercely to obedience, insisting that silence was the only shield against further loss. They warned their companions that speaking out could bring punishment not only upon themselves, but upon the entire cloister. Others, restless and frightened, whispered in corners of betrayal, of secrets kept from them, even as their sisters vanished. The once unified choir of voices at prayer now carried a tremor of mistrust. During meals, the silence seemed sharper, no longer born of discipline but of suspicion. The Mother Superior tried to maintain order, yet even she was not immune to doubt. Some of the nuns believed she knew more than she confessed, that she had received letters or instructions that were never shared. Others pitied her, thinking she too was trapped by forces beyond her command. What had once been a place of shared devotion now felt divided, half bound by loyalty to Rome, half gripped by fear of what might happen next. Each sound in the night startled them. Each shadow in the corridor seemed to conceal a watcher. In their cloistered world, where trust had once been the very fabric of their lives, a rift had opened, and from that rift, the sense of safety that defined convent walls began to crumble. The mystery of the vanished sisters reached beyond the convent when their family ties became known. Many of the women had come from noble houses of Rome, placed within the cloister, not only out of devotion, but also as part of long-standing arrangements between wealthy families and the church. Some had entered with dowries, others with promises that their vows would bring honor to their lineage. When news of their disappearance whispered through the city, relatives began to ask questions that the Vatican was unwilling to answer. Letters were sent from palaces to the papal court, demanding to know why no funerals had been announced, why no official word had been given. The replies, when they came, were vague and unsatisfying, couched in phrases about God's will and obedience. For families used to privilege and influence, this silence felt like an insult. Some pressed harder, but their voices were met with stern warnings to let the matter rest. Among the noble class, suspicion deepened. If women of rank could vanish into silence, then none were truly safe from being sacrificed to secrecy. Whispers of conspiracy passed through candlelit halls, and alliances once friendly to the Vatican grew uneasy. The disappearance had begun within cloistered walls, but its shadow now stretched into the drawing rooms of the city's most powerful houses. Not long after the disappearances, rumors spread of a funeral that took place without witnesses. Some said a small procession of clergy was seen moving at night toward a cemetery attached to a lesser church on the edge of the city. No family members were invited. No bells were tolled. No names were spoken aloud. The burial was done quickly and quietly, as though the church wished the ground to swallow whatever truth might rest there. Those who claimed to have glimpsed the scene described a coffin lowered without ceremony, guarded more by soldiers than mourners. To the people of Rome, such secrecy was alarming. Funerals were public, communal acts, reminders that the dead belonged to God, but also to the community that prayed for them. To bury women in silence, if indeed they were buried at all, suggested that the Vatican feared exposure more than it honored tradition. For some, it confirmed the suspicion that the sisters had not died naturally. Others believed the coffin might have been empty, a ritual without a body, staged to quiet the whispers, but instead inflaming them further. The absence of prayers for the dead, the lack of names recorded in parish lists, left the event shrouded in doubt. In choosing secrecy over ritual, the Church may have sought to contain scandal, yet it only deepened the mystery and left a wound upon the conscience of the faithful. In the weeks that followed, a decree circulated quietly through the city, a papal order forbidding clergy and laity alike from speaking openly of the vanished sisters. The document, read in hushed tones within certain churches, did not mention names or even the convent itself. Instead, it warned that idle talk of scandals weakened faith and dishonored God. Any who spread rumors were said to risk excommunication. This silencing was meant to draw a veil over the matter, but for many it had the opposite effect. The absence of answers now carried the weight of forbidden knowledge, and silence became as telling as confession. Those who once spoke freely lowered their voices, yet they continued to whisper behind closed shutters, convinced that something terrible had been hidden. The more forcefully the Vatican demanded obedience, the more the people suspected guilt. The sisters who remained in the convent obeyed the order, their voices choked by fear, their prayers offered in tremors rather than song. To the outside world, the convent seemed calm again, its routines restored, its bells ringing as they always had. But beneath the surface, the silence of decree only confirmed what many already believed, that the Church had chosen secrecy over truth, and that the voices of the vanished had been deliberately erased. The decree was not simply a command to stop speaking. It was a reminder that within Rome, the power to define what was real or forgotten rested in the hands of the papal throne. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. When the decree of silence had been firmly set in place, the Vatican allowed only one outsider to cross the convent gates, a physician summoned under the cover of necessity. He was called to tend to what was described as an illness among the remaining sisters. No one outside was told which sickness it was, nor how many had suffered. The doctor later left the convent without a word to the public, his face pale, his eyes averted. Some who saw him claimed he appeared shaken, as though he had witnessed more than he wished to remember. Whispers spread that he had been shown rooms not emptied by illness, but by something else entirely. Others said he had been ordered to sign papers of secrecy before leaving the cloister. In Rome, a doctor's silence often spoke more loudly than his words. for the city was accustomed to physicians who gossiped freely about their noble patients. Here, however, nothing escaped his lips, and the absence of explanation deepened suspicion. The convent resumed its routine, but neighbors claimed they heard sobbing in the night, a sound quickly smothered by the tolling of bells. The doctor's visit, instead of offering reassurance, became another shadow upon the mystery. For the people of Rome, it confirmed that the vanished sisters had not been victims of ordinary misfortune. Their disappearance was something the Vatican intended not only to hide, but to erase, even if it meant binding the lips of those who had seen the truth with their own eyes. Among the many questions stirred by the disappearance was one that touched the very heart of faith and devotion. When the convent was searched after the sisters were gone, it was noticed that several sacred objects were missing. Small reliquaries that once held fragments of saints' bones, chalices used for Mass, and embroidered altar cloths that had been passed down for generations were no longer in their places. The absence of these treasures raised as much alarm as the missing women. To some, it suggested theft, perhaps by intruders who had forced their way into the convent under cover of night. To others, it was evidence that the sisters themselves had been removed along with the relics, their fate bound to some secret purpose of the church. Whispers in the city told of wagons leaving the convent grounds by hidden routes, carrying both women and holy objects into the custody of those who wished the matter buried forever. Whatever the truth, the loss of relics struck deeply at the faithful, for such items were not mere ornaments but vessels of divine presence. Their disappearance alongside the nuns suggested that this was more than a matter of illness or disorder. It hinted at something deliberate, a cleansing of both people and sacred possessions, carried out in silence and sealed by command. In this mingling of faith and fear, the line between piety and secrecy grew thin, and many began to wonder whether what was holy had been taken to protect the church or to conceal its shame. As the story of the vanished sisters continued to unsettle the city, another rumor began to take shape, whispered with hesitation even among the faithful. Some claimed that the women had been accused of straying from orthodoxy, of reading forbidden texts, and entertaining ideas that the church regarded as dangerous. The charge of heresy was not spoken aloud by officials, but hints of it lingered in the way silence was enforced. Those who remembered the Inquisition of earlier centuries knew well how accusations could be used to justify secrecy, imprisonment, or worse. Within the convent itself, fragments of conversation suggested that certain books had been confiscated before the disappearances, volumes that did not belong in a cloister. Whether these were theological works considered suspect, or writings passed from hand to hand in secret, no one could say. What mattered was the suspicion they raised. In Rome, the fear of heresy was enough to destroy reputations, to erase lives from public memory. For some, this explanation seemed to answer the riddle, for if the nuns had indeed questioned authority, their removal would be seen by the Vatican as necessary discipline. For others, it only deepened the darkness, for it suggested that the women had not died of illness or been taken by chance, but had been silenced because of thought itself. To the city outside the walls, the word heresy carried with it a terrible weight, and in linking it to the vanished sisters, the scandal moved from mystery into the realm of the forbidden. The whispers of heresy soon gave way to tales of madness. Some who had once visited the convent before the Vanishing spoke of sisters who seemed restless, troubled by visions, or seized by sudden fits of hysteria. It was said that late at night, voices were heard chanting words not from scripture, but from some unknown source, the sounds carrying through the cloister like a troubling echo. A few claim to have seen the women fall into trances during prayer, their eyes fixed on something unseen, their hands trembling as if held by forces beyond their strength. Whether these accounts were true or shaped by rumor, they spread quickly through Rome, feeding the belief that the convent had been touched by something unholy. The Vatican offered no explanation, but its silence only gave weight to the stories. For the faithful, madness was often linked to possession, and possession to sin. Some believed the sisters had invited darkness through disobedience, others that they had been punished unjustly for visions they could not control. Either way, the image of holy women undone by forces within their own cloister struck deeply at the people of Rome. It suggested that even within the most sacred walls, faith could fracture, and the veil of devotion could conceal something far more disturbing. The convent, that had once been seen as a place of purity, now became a symbol of unease, a reminder that sanctity and secrecy often walk together in uneasy silence. As tales of visions and madness wound their way through the city, another rumor took firmer hold, one that seemed less like imagination and more like possibility. It was said that beneath the convent lay an old passage, a tunnel that reached deep into the earth and connected the cloister to other parts of Rome. Some claimed it led directly toward the Vatican itself, others that it joined with the ancient labyrinth of ruins and catacombs beneath the city. Such passages were not uncommon in monasteries and palaces, built long ago for safety in times of war or for secrecy in times of unrest. If such a tunnel truly existed, it could have offered both escape and abduction, a hidden route by which the vanished nuns were carried away without ever passing through the convent gate. Neighbors spoke of hearing the sound of stones shifting at night, or of carriages rolling at odd hours when no one could be seen entering the convent yard. The Vatican neither confirmed nor denied the stories, and this silence only fueled belief. For the faithful, the idea of holy women spirited away through underground passages seemed both terrifying and plausible. It was a reminder that the walls of Rome were layered with centuries of secrets, and that what lay hidden beneath the earth often shaped what was seen above. Whether real or imagined, the story of the tunnel gave the disappearances a shape, a means by which they might have been carried out, though the question of why remained shrouded in darkness. In the weeks that followed, several witnesses whispered of seeing armed guards near the convent after nightfall. These men were not the usual watchmen who kept order in the city streets, but soldiers of the papal household, recognizable by their bearing even when their uniforms were half hidden beneath cloaks. They came and went at hours when ordinary citizens slept, their lanterns flickering against the convent's heavy walls. Some neighbors claimed to have heard the clang of iron and the murmur of commands, though no formal record of their presence was ever made. The suggestion that soldiers had entered the cloister sent a wave of unease through Rome, for convents were meant to be sanctuaries beyond intrusion. If the guards had come to protect, why was nothing announced? If they had come to remove, why was nothing admitted? The very sight of them fed suspicion that the Vatican itself had ordered the vanishing. To the people of the city, the presence of soldiers at sacred walls confirmed that whatever had taken place was no accident. Their silence, their secrecy, their swift departures into the night became part of the legend that grew around the scandal. The image of armed men stepping across thresholds meant only for the faithful left an impression that lingered long after their lanterns had disappeared into the dark. Not long after the guards were sighted, whispers spread of a discovery even more troubling. It was said that one of the missing sisters had kept a diary, a small book hidden among her belongings, filled with private reflections. The surviving nuns who spoke of it remembered pages where she recorded her doubts, her fears, and strange events she claimed to have witnessed within the convent. According to them, the diary vanished soon after the investigations began. Some believed it was taken by the confessor, others that it was seized directly by officials sent from the Vatican. No trace of it was ever found, and no copy or fragment survived. The very idea of its existence was enough to inflame curiosity, for a personal account could have given voice to women otherwise silenced. In a city where records were carefully controlled, the thought of a diary filled with unguarded words was dangerous. The people of Rome imagined what it might have contained: confessions of forbidden books, sightings of secret visitors, or even knowledge of a planned removal. Whether such things were truly written is impossible to know. Yet the fact that the diary disappeared became proof in itself to many. If it had been empty of revelation, why would it have been taken? The missing journal became another absence, as heavy as the vanished sisters, and in its silence the legend of the scandal grew larger than any written testimony could have made it. As the weeks passed, the convent's leader, the Mother Superior, became the focus of growing unease. At first, she tried to maintain the daily rhythm, leading prayers and urging the remaining sisters to accept God's will in silence. But soon her strength seemed to falter. Some claimed she was struck with sudden illness, confined to her cell, and rarely seen again. Others whispered that she had been taken away under guard, her authority quietly stripped by those who feared she might reveal more than she should. The accounts differed, yet what remained consistent was that her presence vanished just as surely as that of the other sisters. Without her, the convent drifted in uncertainty. Leadership passed to others chosen quickly, and their devotion seemed directed as much toward obedience to outside command as to the well-being of the women under their care. In Rome, the disappearance of the Mother Superior was seen as a turning point. If even she, entrusted with guiding her community, could be removed without explanation, then the scandal was larger than anyone dared admit. For the faithful, it suggested that the silence was not merely the choice of frightened nuns, but the will of higher powers determined to suppress the truth. The absence of the Mother Superior became another void, a wound that left the cloister even more vulnerable to fear and suspicion. At the same time that the convent struggled with loss, Rome itself was adjusting to a new pontiff. The pope who ascended to the throne of St. Peter was a man of rigid discipline and fierce conviction. He inherited a church under strain, facing revolts in the streets and pressure from foreign powers. To him, stability mattered above all else, and silence was a tool as valuable as doctrine. During his reign, the scandal of the vanished nuns was never spoken of in official documents, not in sermons, nor in public decrees. When petitions reached the Vatican from noble families, they were met with carefully chosen words that offered comfort without detail, faith without fact. The Pope himself never mentioned the convent in his writings, though his reforms touched many other parts of the Church. For many in Rome, this silence was telling. If the highest authority in Christendom would not address the matter, then the truth must have been too dangerous to allow into daylight. The Pope's shadow loomed over the convent even without his presence, for it was his command that kept lips sealed, his will that ensured the story remained buried. In his determination to preserve the church from scandal, he left behind a deeper one, for the silence itself became a monument to the vanished sisters. It was as if their absence had been woven into the fabric of papal power, a secret meant to be forgotten, yet never fully erased. Among the darker whispers that circulated in Rome was the claim that the Vatican maintained hidden chambers beneath its palaces, cells where those who defied its will could be confined without trial. These stories were not new. For centuries, Romans had spoken of passages, dungeons, and locked doors within the apostolic palace that no visitor ever saw. After the nuns vanished, such rumors gained new life. Some said the women had not died at all, but had been taken into those depths, kept in silence as punishment for disobedience or knowledge they should never have carried. The idea was terrifying, yet it felt plausible in a city where the church's authority reached into every corner. No evidence was ever shown, but silence itself became evidence. If the sisters had been buried, why were there no funerals? If they had fled, why had no trace of them surfaced beyond Rome? The notion that they lived still, locked away in chambers beneath the Vatican, took hold in the popular imagination. It was whispered that one might hear faint cries when walking near the palace walls at night, though such tales were spoken only in private for fear of retribution. Whether invention or memory, the belief in secret dungeons gave the scandal a new shape. The sisters were no longer seen only as victims of illness or error, but as prisoners of a power that preferred shadows to confession. In this way, the legend of the vanished women became intertwined with the oldest fears of Rome, fears that the Vatican's walls were not only barriers of stone but prisons of silence. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. As the story deepened into rumor and silence, Rome's streets carried their own version of events. Market stalls buzzed with quiet retellings, taverns filled with half-spoken stories, and servants carried whispers from palaces to alleyways. Each telling added new layers, some claiming the sisters had been poisoned, others that they had been spirited away to distant monasteries where their names were changed and their past erased. A few insisted they had been taken abroad, hidden in convents under foreign rule, so that no Roman eyes would ever see them again. None of these stories could be confirmed, yet all of them found eager listeners. Ordinary Romans, who had long lived in the shadow of the Vatican, knew that truth was often swallowed before it could surface. They trusted whispers more than decrees, believing that where silence was demanded, secrets surely festered. Even those who doubted the tales admitted the unease that lingered around the convent gates. Passers-by crossed themselves when walking past, while children dared each other to approach its walls. The convent, once a place of prayer and refuge, became in the imagination of the people a haunted house of faith, where voices had been stolen and where each echo of the bells carried not devotion but warning. In this way, the scandal ceased to be only an internal matter of the church. It became part of the city's own folklore, woven into the life of Rome like the shadows that stretched across its ancient stones. Some of the most troubling whispers came from those who had once served the convent from outside its walls. Merchants who delivered bread and wine, craftsmen who repaired doors or windows, and washerwomen who collected garments for cleaning all noticed sudden changes after the disappearances. Deliveries were refused without explanation, repairs postponed, and laundry withheld. One baker claimed he saw fewer sisters at the gate when he brought his goods, though the convent had not reduced its order. Another insisted that voices he once heard singing in the courtyard were replaced by silence, broken only by hurried footsteps. These accounts were small details, easily dismissed. Yet together they painted a picture of a cloister withdrawing further into secrecy. Ordinary people who had long treated the convent with reverence now began to regard it with suspicion. Some said they saw cloaked figures arrive at night, paying in coin for the supplies once fetched by the sisters themselves. Others believed that the convent was no longer a house of prayer, but a stage set by the Vatican to mask what had truly taken place within. The merchants and workers of Rome, used to being the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, carried these tales into markets and taverns, ensuring that the mystery of the vanished nuns could not be contained by decree alone. Their quiet observations gave shape to fears that the Vatican worked to erase, and in the process, they preserved the story in the daily memory of the city. Not all the voices that carried the story belonged to merchants or neighbors. Some priests outside the Vatican's direct reach began to murmur their unease in private. They had long been taught obedience to Rome, yet the silence surrounding the convent troubled them deeply. One parish priest, according to accounts later, whispered among his flock, admitted he had been approached by a sister before her disappearance. She spoke only briefly, asking for prayers, her eyes filled with fear. After she was gone, he wondered whether her words had been a plea for help. Others recalled confessions that hinted at unrest within the cloister, confessions that ended abruptly when the nuns themselves ceased to appear at church. The priests did not dare preach openly about the matter, but their hesitation in answering questions betrayed their unease. To the faithful, the reluctance of their shepherds was more convincing than any decree from Rome. If even the clergy stumbled over their words, then the scandal was real. These hesitant voices, though never recorded in official histories, gave life to the legend. They reminded the people that behind the Vatican's command for silence, there were still those whose consciences stirred. Though few priests risked open defiance, their whispered doubts added a thread of moral weight to the growing tapestry of rumor, ensuring that the vanished sisters remained present in memory, even if their bodies were gone. As time passed, the scandal of the vanished sisters began to echo beyond Rome. Travelers carried the tale across the Italian countryside, and soon foreign visitors heard fragments of the story in markets and inns. Pilgrims on their way to the Holy City repeated what they had been told, carrying whispers back to their own lands. In this way, the disappearance of a handful of cloistered women grew into a story with no borders. In France, it was spoken of as proof of Vatican secrecy. In Spain, some claimed it was punishment for hidden sins. In the courts of Northern Europe, it was repeated as evidence that the Church could not be trusted to guard even its own. None of these accounts agreed, yet all were bound by a common theme: silence where there should have been truth. The Vatican may have sought to bury the scandal with decrees, but by the very act of forbidding words, it ensured that words spread further. The absence of names in official records only deepened curiosity. The lack of explanation gave rise to endless interpretations. In foreign lands, the vanished nuns became symbols more than women, symbols of secrecy, symbols of obedience, and symbols of fear. The scandal that began within stone walls had escaped those walls entirely, carried on the breath of travelers until it became part of Europe's whispered lore. What began as a local silence had become an international question, one that the Vatican could not easily smother. In the heart of Rome, however, the memory of the vanished sisters remained strongest among those who lived nearest to the convent. Families in the surrounding streets grew accustomed to the unnatural quiet that seemed to hang over its gates. Children who once played near the walls now avoided them, muttering that the convent was cursed. Candlemakers, bakers, and wine sellers who once supplied the cloister began to whisper of unpaid debts or abrupt changes in orders, as though the convent itself were shrinking in spirit as well as in number. Some swore they had seen a candle burning late into the night in windows that were usually dark, the faint glow vanishing suddenly, as though someone had snuffed it in haste. Neighbors claimed the bells no longer rang with the same steady rhythm, but hesitated, faltering as if reluctant to mark the hours. For the people of the district, the convent had once been a source of stability, a place where life seemed eternal and unchanging. Now it stood as a reminder of secrecy and fear, an empty shell that inspired more dread than devotion. The scandal had moved from whispered rumor to lived experience, pressing itself into the daily lives of those who could not escape the shadow of the cloister. Even without official records or confessions, the people knew what they saw, and in their eyes, silence had become the most damning proof of all. For many of the faithful, the silence of the church became a greater scandal than the vanishing itself. Rome was a city where ritual marked every stage of life, where bells tolled for births, deaths, and processions of the saints. To deny the vanished sisters these signs of remembrance was to erase them not only from history, but from eternity. Some parishioners began to light candles in secret, dedicating them to unnamed souls who had been lost. These small acts of devotion took place quietly inside chapels, away from the gaze of priests who might forbid them. The people prayed for the sisters as though they were martyrs, women whose voices had been smothered, but whose presence lingered. For ordinary Romans, faith was not blind to truth. They could believe in the holiness of the church and still see its flaws, just as they could revere the saints while mourning the failures of men who wore the crown of Peter. The scandal forced them into a painful balance, loyalty to their faith and suspicion of the very institution that guarded it. In this way, the vanished nuns lived on, not through official records or sermons, but through whispered prayers and candles flickering in dark corners, reminders that the faithful would not allow them to be forgotten. Years passed, and yet the memory of the vanished sisters refused to fade. Even as new generations of nuns entered the convent, the shadow of those who had been lost lingered in every corridor. Some of the younger women who took their vows whispered that they could feel the presence of those who had come before them, as though the walls themselves remembered. In the city outside, the story became less a scandal and more a legend, retold with variations but never abandoned. Old men in taverns spoke of it as a cautionary tale, while mothers warned their daughters never to trust too fully in silence. The Vatican's refusal to acknowledge the event only sharpened its place in memory. Each year that passed without explanation confirmed for many that something had indeed been hidden, something too dangerous to admit. Rome was a city built on layers, where ancient ruins lay beneath streets and forgotten catacombs stretched under churches. In the same way, the story of the vanished nuns settled into the foundation of the city itself, a hidden truth lying just beneath the surface of daily life. No decree, no sermon, no new pontiff could erase it. Instead, it grew with time, until the vanished sisters became less like individuals and more like a symbol of secrecy, of silence, and of the cost of obedience. The longer the story endured, the more it began to attract writers and chroniclers who sought to capture what official histories ignored. In dusty corners of libraries and private studies, accounts of the vanished nuns appeared in journals, letters, and travelogues. Some were no more than fragments, brief mentions of a convent scandal in Rome, written down by foreigners passing through the city. Others were longer, weaving rumor and imagination into elaborate tales. A few dared to suggest that they had spoken with witnesses, though their names were never revealed. None of these writings carry the weight of Vatican approval, yet they ensured that the memory could not be silenced entirely. The irony was plain to those who studied them. By attempting to erase the scandal, the Church had given it a second life in the hands of storytellers. Each retelling made the mystery larger, turning the vanished nuns into symbols of Rome's hidden truths. Scholars centuries later would argue over the reliability of these texts, but even the most skeptical admitted that silence itself was evidence of something being concealed. What had once been whispered in taverns and alleyways had now taken shape in ink, ensuring that the scandal would travel farther than the walls of the convent, or even the city of Rome itself. In this way, legend became as enduring as stone, written not by decree but by memory and curiosity. Though the Vatican worked tirelessly to suppress all memory of the scandal, fragments continue to surface in the archives of noble families. In private collections, letters written in anxious hands told of daughters and sisters who had entered the convent and never returned. Some pleaded for answers, others hinted at suspicions they dared not speak openly. These letters were rarely shown beyond the walls of the family estates, for to accuse the Church directly was to risk ruin. Still, they were kept, tucked away among wills, contracts, and genealogies, a quiet protest against enforced silence. Generations later, descendants would stumble upon them and wonder at the secrecy their ancestors endured. The nobility, bound by loyalty to Rome, yet also wounded by the loss of kin, carried the scandal like an open wound beneath layers of obedience. For them, the vanished sisters were not just faceless figures in a rumor, but flesh and blood. Women whose names were once spoken at family tables, and whose absence could not be erased by papal decree. These hidden records, though never public, preserved a truth more intimate than any chronicle. They stood as testimony that the scandal was not only a matter of rumor in the streets, but also of grief in the grandest halls of Rome. Even as silence pressed down upon Rome, strange stories emerged of visions within the convent itself. Some of the younger sisters who remained spoke of hearing footsteps at night in empty corridors, the sound of sandals brushing the stone as if those who were gone still walked among them. Others claimed that, when they gathered for prayer, they felt an unseen presence filling the choir stalls, as though voices joined theirs in chants, though no lips moved. A few whispered of shadows that lingered too long in doorways, or the sudden scent of incense when no censer burned. Whether these were the stirrings of imagination, the weight of grief, or something else entirely, such visions were enough to deepen the sense of dread. To the faithful outside the cloister, tales of apparitions seemed fitting, for the sisters had not been granted funerals or public remembrance. Spirits denied their rights were thought to wander, restless and unresolved. The Church made no comment on such accounts, neither confirming nor condemning them. Yet the very refusal to address the stories only gave them more life. For those who believed, the apparitions were not signs of superstition, but reminders that truth cannot be buried, and that the voices silenced in life may yet find ways to speak. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. As the visions circulated within the convent, others in Rome began to interpret them as signs of divine displeasure. Some whispered that the vanished sisters were martyrs, their absence a punishment upon the church for its secrecy. When storms broke over the city with unusual violence, or when crops in the countryside failed, murmurs rose that heaven itself had grown angry. Superstitious tales spread quickly. Flocks of birds circling the convent roof, candles that refused to stay lit on the altar, prayers interrupted by sudden gusts of wind that swept through the chapel. None of these events were written into official records, but they lived on in memory, shared in markets, in doorways, and in hushed voices around hearths. Even skeptics could not entirely dismiss them, for the weight of silence left room for any possibility. To those who believed, the disturbances were not mere coincidences but messages, warnings that the truth could not be locked away without consequence. Whether real or imagined, they gave the scandal a sense of divine urgency. It was no longer just a story of secrecy within stone walls, but a tale that touched the heavens themselves, as if the vanished sisters had become witnesses beyond the grave. As fear of divine punishment grew, some began to connect the scandal with the political unrest that gripped Rome in those same years. The city was already a place of tension, where revolution simmered in the streets, and whispers of rebellion drifted through taverns and workshops. To many, the silence surrounding the vanished nuns became part of this larger unease. If the church could erase women without explanation, what else might it erase in its struggle to maintain power? The scandal became a symbol, folded into the language of dissent. Rebels muttered that the convent was proof of corruption at the highest levels, while loyalists warned that such talk was dangerous and could bring punishment upon entire families. The Vatican, desperate to hold authority, treated both the uprising in the streets and the whispers of the convent with the same weapon, silence. But for ordinary Romans, the two could not be separated. The absence of the sisters was another sign that the old order was cracking, that even the walls of faith could no longer protect against secrecy and fear. The vanished women became part of the city's unrest, their memory woven into the spirit of resistance, whether or not they had ever sought such a role in life. In the midst of this unrest, foreign diplomats stationed in Rome began to take notice. They heard the rumors in markets, saw the unease among the people, and reported back to their courts that something was amiss within the walls of the Vatican. For them, the scandal was more than a curiosity. It was a sign of weakness in an institution that claimed authority over all of Christendom. Some envoys quietly gathered their own information, speaking with merchants, servants, and even discontented clergy. Their reports varied, but they all agreed on one point. The Vatican was hiding something. In distant capitals, kings and ministers debated whether the disappearance of cloistered women was a local matter or a symptom of greater decay within Rome. The story began to be shaped into a tool, wielded not for truth, but for politics. Rivals of the papacy whispered that the church was corrupt beyond saving, while allies chose to defend its silence as a necessary shield against slander. In this way, the vanished sisters became part of a struggle that reached far beyond their convent their absence used as evidence in the battles of diplomacy. The Vatican may have succeeded in preventing an open scandal in Rome, but had failed to keep the story from shaping the way the rest of Europe saw its power. As diplomats carried the story abroad, artists and writers in Rome began to weave it into their own work, though always with caution. Painters sketched veiled figures fading into shadow, their outlines barely visible against cloister walls. Poets wrote verses about silence heavier than stone, hinting at loss without daring to name the vanished. Playwrights slipped lines into their works about women erased from memory, cloaking their meaning in allegory so as not to invite censure. These creative expressions never mentioned the scandal directly, yet the people of Rome understood their veiled references. In a city where open speech was forbidden, art became another language for memory. To those who encountered these works, the vanished, sisters were not forgotten. They lived in brushstrokes, in stanzas, in scenes that carried grief disguised as beauty. The Vatican may have erased their names from records, but imagination refused to let them vanish entirely. Even centuries later, some of these pieces still hang in forgotten chapels or lie hidden in archives, their meanings overlooked by those who no longer remember the story. Yet to those who know, the art is unmistakable, a quiet defiance that testifies to the fact that silence can be resisted, even when spoken words are forbidden. Over time, the scandal became part of the city's unspoken heritage, passed down in fragments from one generation to the next. Grandmothers told their grandchildren not to walk too close to the convent walls. Street performers wove bits of the tale into riddles and songs, changing the names but keeping the sorrow intact. Local guides, walking tourists past the silent facade, sometimes paused a beat too long, as if deciding whether to tell what they knew. Even priests, long trained to avoid the subject, would fall silent when asked about the convent's history. The story no longer needed facts to endure. It had become a kind of shadow history, rooted in emotion rather than record, impossible to verify and equally impossible to forget. In this way, the memory of the vanished sisters transcended the tools of officialdom. No signature, no seal, no marble plaque marked their place in time, yet the people of Rome carry them forward. Like the old ruins beneath the city streets, their story lay beneath the surface, sometimes forgotten, sometimes remembered, but always present. And in this layered city, where ancient stones and fresh prayers coexist, that quiet presence became its own kind of permanence. Some say that late at night, the convent still holds secrets in its walls, not in ghosts or apparitions, but in the echo of unanswered questions. The halls, though repainted and restored, seem never to lose a certain chill. The floorboards in certain rooms creak in ways they shouldn't, even when no foot crosses them. A locked door at the end of a corridor, now used only for storage, was once said to lead to the heart of the cloister, where the last moments of the vanished sisters may have played out. Nuns who have served there in recent decades often speak of feeling watched, not with menace, but with longing, as though something unfinished hovers in the air. One former abbess, now retired, admitted in a rare interview that while she found no evidence in the archives, she always believed something had happened that was never made right. These small impressions felt, but not spoken form, the only trace left of those who vanished. Though no markers bear their names, and no prayers are offered in official ceremony, the weight of their absence presses gently on the present. It is in the silence that their memory lingers, not in the noise of history books. but in the pauses between the facts. Outside the convent, time has moved forward, but not without reminders. The city of Rome is full of sacred places layered with forgotten pain. In quiet courtyards, pigeons gather near fountains whose builders are long unnamed. Streets curve around ruins where blood once dried on stone. And yet, life continues. Children play, bells ring, and candles are lit. The convent, now modernized in part, has taken on new purposes over the years. Parts of the building house retired sisters, others serve as archives or storage for church documents. But even those who walk its halls daily admit that the past clings to the structure like damp in old plaster. It is not spoken of openly, but it is understood. Those who know the story rarely ask questions aloud, and those who do not know often sense a quiet, undefinable sorrow in the air. Sometimes, a visiting scholar will look up at the convent's windows and wonder why they feel such stillness there. The answer, of course, is never given, not in words. Rome guards its secrets with elegance. It offers its truths, not in declarations, but in echoes. And the story of the nuns who vanished remains one of its most haunting echoes of all. Modern historians who dare to investigate the scandal often find themselves walking a thin line. The Vatican's archives, while extensive, are not open to every request. Researchers must navigate layers of protocol, gaining permissions that sometimes take years to secure. Even when granted access, they find that some files are curiously incomplete or missing altogether. A few have reported documents with dates that don't align, pages numbered out of order, or files that reference events which no longer exist in any official ledger. One archivist, speaking off record, described the experience as like reading a sentence with half the words erased. Despite the obstacles, scholars continue to search. They comb through letters, personal diaries, and local parish records in hopes of piecing together fragments. The pattern is always the same. A flurry of recorded activity around the convent, then a sudden void. No deaths listed, no transfers logged, just absence. And in that absence, they find their only clue. For many researchers, it is not the presence of damning evidence that reveals the truth. It is the deliberate emptiness, the intentional silence that speaks the loudest. The archive does not confess, but neither does it lie convincingly. In recent decades, a few independent journalists and documentarians have tried to bring the story to light for a wider audience. They approach it not as a conspiracy, but as a cold case, an unsolved disappearance where the suspects are not individuals, but institutions. Some have interviewed descendants of the families connected to the convent. Others have walked the streets of Rome with old maps, trying to align past and present. One filmmaker denied access to the Vatican archives, recreated scenes using actors in shadowy corridors, relying on emotional truth where factual clarity was denied. The results were haunting, and though some critics dismissed them as speculative, others praised the work for reviving forgotten pain. Each effort adds something to the story, a new angle, a new voice, a new attempt to honor the women lost. The Vatican, for its part, remains silent. It does not respond to inquiries, and it does not defend its past actions. It simply waits, as it always has, trusting in time to soften the edges. But for those drawn to the mystery, silence is not an answer. It is an invitation to listen more closely, to ask again, and to search for what was taken not only from the convent, but from history itself. Among those who have pursued the truth most persistently are not just scholars or skeptics, but women within the church itself. Some modern nuns, educated and outspoken, have quietly taken up the work of recovering the stories their predecessors were denied. In interviews and theological writings, they ask why the voices of women religious are so often omitted from official records. They speak not in anger, but in mourning for the loss of memory, the denial of dignity, the quiet erasure that accompanies events like the 1,831 disappearances. These sisters do not accuse without care. They know the weight of tradition, the value of faith. But they also believe that healing requires honesty. In retreats and academic forums, they share what little is known of the vanished nuns, and they invite others to remember them not only as victims of a forgotten scandal, but as individuals who gave their lives to a calling and were repaid with silence. To these modern sisters, the story is not a closed chapter. It is a living wound within the body of the church, one that must be acknowledged before it can be healed. And so they continue, quietly and steadily, to honor what has been hidden, believing that remembrance is an act of justice. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. As the decades passed and Rome evolved, the old convent remained standing, a structure both ordinary and extraordinary in its endurance. Tourists rarely noticed it. It wasn't gilded or famous, not marked on maps with stars or plaques. It blended into the quiet rhythm of neighborhood life, its facade aging with dignity, its windows shuttered in the afternoon sun. But to those who lived nearby, the building was more than stone and mortar. It was a memory keeper. Local children were taught not to shout near its walls. Florists left extra blossoms on its doorstep on certain holy days. At Easter and All Saints, neighbors lit candles not just for their own dead, but for those whose names had been forgotten. Some said the convent sighed at night, as old buildings do, expelling the breath of years it had silently held. Whether or not anyone still lived inside, the structure was never truly empty. Those who passed by often felt it watching, not with menace, but with patience, as though waiting for something to be made right. Inside, the air remained cooler than it should have been, even in the height of summer. Dust settled in familiar corners. Some rooms had been sealed off for decades, their keys lost or hidden. In the archives beneath the floor, boxes of correspondence, handwritten notes, and fragments of forgotten ledgers remained untouched by Vatican hands, their contents too mundane or too troubling to catalog. Every now and then, a junior clerk would be sent to examine the inventory, only to emerge unsettled, claiming the boxes didn't quite match the official records. But nothing ever came of it. These irregularities joined the long list of small inconsistencies that defined the legacy of the vanished sisters, details that refused to disappear, though no one would formally address them. Even the chapel retained its weight. The pews had been polished. The hymns were newer, but beneath it all, the stone remained unchanged, the very floor where the sisters once knelt. The marks of their routine lingered in the grooves of the altar steps, in the worn edge of the lectern, in the faint echo of footsteps long stilled. The present built itself over the past, but the past had not gone. It had simply fallen silent. Those who came to pray often left with more questions than comfort, sensing something unspoken in the room. It wasn't grief exactly. It was the presence of something unresolved. The chapel, like the convent, did not mourn. It remembered. Not all who searched for the truth did so out of piety or academic interest. Some were drawn by something harder to name, a sense of unfinished business, or the feeling that certain stories cling to the living until someone chooses to carry them forward. One such figure was a Roman historian named Lucia Ferretti, a woman who had grown up just blocks from the convent. As a child, she'd walked past its shadowed gates with her grandmother, who always crossed herself and muttered a phrase in dialect too soft to catch. As an adult, Lucia specialized in church history, particularly the overlooked narratives of women. The story of the vanished nuns was never part of her formal studies, but it never quite left her either. After years of working through official archives and publishing essays on forgotten saints and suppressed relics, she turned her attention back to her neighborhood. Lucia began by collecting the stories spoken over coffee, the fragments half-remembered by the elderly, the warnings passed down like family recipes. She mapped out timelines, sifted through death records, and traced the final mentions of the sisters in local correspondence. Her findings, though inconclusive, painted a picture of sudden disruption, followed by forced silence. She was meticulous, careful not to claim more than the evidence allowed. But she noted what others had only whispered. The disappearance had coincided with internal Vatican tensions, including harsh disciplinary measures and the reshuffling of several key clerics. It was not proof, but it was a pattern. In historical work, sometimes patterns speak louder than declarations. She published her findings in a small academic journal, expecting little fanfare, but her article sparked quiet ripples. Other historians began to revisit the convent's records. Clergy who had once dismissed the story grew cautious in interviews. And one Vatican librarian, long retired, reached out anonymously with a message. "You are closer than you think, but the truth is buried beneath obedience." It was not a warning, it was an invitation. For Lucia, it confirmed what she already sensed, that this story, long silenced, was waiting not just to be uncovered, but to be heard with reverence. Lucia's quiet investigation stirred something beyond academia. It began to draw the attention of those within the church, who had always known, or at least suspected, that pieces of their institutional past had been deliberately concealed. Among them was Father Matteo, an elderly Jesuit who had spent most of his career as a theological advisor in Rome. Long retired, he had grown increasingly outspoken in his final years, especially on the topic of moral accountability within sacred institutions. He read Lucia's article with the intensity of someone who recognized the gaps not just in the story, but in his own lifetime of silence. And for the first time in decades, he returned to the convent not as a priest on official business, but as a man burdened by what he had once overheard but chosen to forget. What he remembered was not dramatic. A conversation, decades ago, between two senior clergy in a private corridor. A mention of the sister's disappearance spoken in a hushed, annoyed tone, followed by a command to let it rest. At the time, he had assumed it was a matter already resolved or best left untouched. But age has a way of unearthing regrets, and Matteo could no longer accept silence as prudence. He contacted Lucia, not to give her names or files, those had long vanished, but to offer something just as important: witness. He told her what he had heard, how it had been framed, and what it had felt like to sit inside the church's machine while pieces of human truth were smoothed over for the sake of decorum. Lucia recorded the conversation, not to publish it, but to keep as testimony. It was not enough to rewrite history, but it added weight to the echo. A priest had confirmed that there had been knowledge partial, unspoken, but real. And that knowledge had been buried, not out of uncertainty, but out of choice. In that confession, small as it seemed, something long frozen began to thaw. Word of Lucia's research and Father Matteo's private testimony began to travel beyond scholarly circles. It reached former nuns, archivists, and even a few journalists who specialized in Vatican affairs. What emerged was not a rush of new facts, but a gradual shift in tone. People who had once dismissed the 1,831 disappearance as myth or exaggeration began to speak more cautiously. Unverified became unresolved. Legend became question. And in that shift, the dignity of the missing began to return. For the first time in generations, they were not treated as superstition or rumor, but as real women who had lived, worked, prayed, and vanished without explanation. This quiet acknowledgement sparked a new movement among younger Catholics and scholars alike. They began to ask broader questions. What does the Church owe to the forgotten? How many stories have been swallowed by silence? In university chapels and community circles, the story of the vanished sisters became a case study not in scandal, but in moral reckoning. Not everyone agreed on the details, but most agreed on this truth, even when delayed, is part of healing. A few students launched a digital project mapping known convent closures and disciplinary actions during the same era. Others created a virtual memorial, listing the names of every nun who had served at the convent in the years before the disappearance, whether or not she had vanished. Visitors could light digital candles and leave prayers. Though it may seem symbolic, to many it felt like restoration. Memory, once scattered and hidden, was being gathered. Lucia, watching it all unfold, felt both hope and sorrow. The Church had not offered an apology. The Vatican had not opened its records, and yet something had changed. The story had been carried across the threshold of forgetting, and now lived again not in archives, but in conscience. Back at the convent, life carried on in its quiet way. A handful of sisters still lived there, though most were elderly or transferred in from other communities. They tended a small garden behind the main building, grew herbs in clay pots, and held prayer hours in the refurbished chapel. Visitors came rarely, usually relatives or church officials on routine business. But one sister, an English-born novice named Catherine, had begun asking quiet questions. She had joined the order not for mystery or tradition, but out of deep, searching faith. And something about the building unsettled her. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the feeling of something left unfinished, as though each prayer spoken aloud echoed off a wall where no one had ever responded. Catherine read about the vanished sisters late one night in an online forum, stumbling across a translated copy of Lucia's original article. The story stirred something in her, not just curiosity, but a sense of obligation. She began her own small search, asking the older sisters what they remembered. Most smiled softly and changed the subject. One offered a cryptic reply. There are some things we pray for without expecting answers. Still, Catherine persisted. She visited the convent's storage rooms, paging through ledgers with worn bindings and brittle ink. In one, she found a faint notation beside a roster of names. It read only, "Departed, not recorded." No date, no details, but the handwriting was careful, deliberate. Someone had known. She brought it to the Mother Superior, expecting resistance. Instead, the older woman simply closed the book and whispered, "Pray for them." That was all. No permission, no denial. Just a quiet invitation to remember. And Catherine did. In her daily prayers, she began to speak the names of the sisters who had no known end. It was a small act, but it mattered. The act of prayer, repeated daily and quietly, began to shift something in the life of the convent. Sister Catherine, though young, had become a kind of steward for the memory of those lost. Her devotion wasn't dramatic or performative. She didn't speak of the vanished sisters to tourists or make public declarations. She simply lit a candle each evening, after the last bell had rung, and sat alone in the chapel, murmuring their names aloud. Names recovered from ledgers, parish listings, and a few scattered handwritten records she had carefully pieced together. There were still gaps, still missing names, but even those she honored with silence. The gesture wasn't investigative, it was reverent, and slowly, others joined her. At first, it was only one or two older nuns who came to sit beside her. They didn't speak. They simply watched, listened, and sometimes wept. Over time, more sisters joined. What had begun as one woman's act of remembrance became a ritual. It had no official blessing, no directive from Rome, but it grew, nonetheless. Soon, the convent began holding an annual service unofficial, quiet, attended only by those who wished. They called it the Vigil of the Absent. There was no sermon, only candlelight, hymns, and long pauses between names. To those unfamiliar with the story, it might have seemed like any other prayer gathering. But for those who knew, it was something more. It was an act of reclamation. Word of the vigil reached Lucia, who attended 1 year in secret, slipping in among the sisters as a guest. She left a note at the door, unsigned. "They are not lost. You are carrying them." Sister Catherine never learned who left it, but she didn't need to. She already believed it. Beyond the convent walls, the memory of the vanished sisters continued to ripple outward, not as a sensation or scandal, but as a quiet current running through the lives of those who had come to care. A group of theology students in Germany began translating the original ledgers into digital format, creating an open-access archive where researchers could contribute notes and theories. In Argentina, a retired librarian named Teresa began a blog dedicated to stories of forgotten women in church history, dedicating an entire section to the convent in Rome. Even in places far removed from the Vatican's shadow, the silence of 1,831 found resonance. In each act of remembrance, the story became less about mystery and more about meaning, what it reveals about power, belief, and the human need to be witnessed. One summer, a small exhibition opened in a private museum just outside of Florence. It was titled "The Absence of Light," and featured items connected not to the nuns themselves, but to the memory of them, photographs of the convent, excerpts from Lucia's writings, anonymous notes from the vigil, and a single display of 50 unmarked candles. Visitors were encouraged to walk in silence, reflect, and if they wished, write their own thoughts in a communal book. Thousands did. Some wrote prayers. Others wrote confessions. A few wrote apologies. and more than a few simply wrote, "I remember." The Vatican made no formal comment on the exhibition, no condemnations, no acknowledgments, but someone, days before the closing, left a sealed envelope with the museum staff. Inside was a single page, typed on Vatican letterhead, but unsigned. It read, "There were sisters. They were lost, not forgotten." The envelope, unsigned, untraceable, became the subject of much speculation. Was it genuine? A quiet leak from someone within the Vatican archives? Or merely the work of a sympathetic outsider hoping to lend closure to a story that had long resisted it? No one knew. The museum director chose not to investigate further. Instead, he placed the letter in the final case of the exhibit, framed behind glass. It stood beneath the candles, its message simple and stark. Visitors paused there longer than anywhere else. Some cried. Others stood motionless for minutes, as though waiting for the words to settle into their bones. There were sisters. They were lost. Not forgotten. It didn't erase the years of silence or the unanswered questions, but it offered something rare: acknowledgement without explanation, a truth stripped of politics. After the exhibit closed, the letter was donated to the digital archive alongside Lucia's materials. There, it joined a growing web of remembrances, scanned pages of forgotten rosters, voice recordings of oral traditions, photographs of aging walls, and hand-carved pews. The story had outlived its concealment. It was now too dispersed to be erased. The church never opened its vaults, never issued a statement, never named the sisters aloud. But across the world, people did. In small chapels, schoolhouses, even private homes, readers lit candles and whispered names that had once vanished from record. Some added new names of women erased in other ways, from other times. The Vigil had become more than a ritual for 50 nuns. It had become a language for all those lost in silence. And in that shared act of quiet remembrance, the sisters of 1,831 were no longer alone. In the end, there was no grand revelation, no hidden diary unearthed in a crypt, no confession scrawled on fading parchment. What emerged instead was something quieter, but perhaps more lasting, a collective refusal to forget. The Vatican remained still, unyielding in its posture, as it had so often across centuries. But outside its gates, the story moved freely. It passed from historian to novice, from archivist to poet, from parishioner to stranger. It became part of a new kind of liturgy, one not written in canon law, but in memory and care. The sisters who had vanished were not resurrected, but they were restored, given voice, not through evidence, but through witness. Not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be held. Lucia continued her work, though she spoke less frequently of the convent. She understood that some stories reach their completion not when all is known, but when enough is remembered to bring peace. Catherine remained at the convent, her candlelit vigils now joined by others, each evening marked not by answers, but by presence. The chapel, once a space of uneasy stillness, grew warm again, not because the past had been corrected, but because it was no longer abandoned. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of Rome, where old stone absorbs more than it reveals, the convent stood, as it always had, with its shutters drawn against the evening sun. But now, the silence it held felt less like suppression and more like prayer. A long, patient prayer whispered by many voices across many years. A prayer that said, You were here, you were taken, and you are still remembered.